Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jason Levine, and thank you for joining me today for part one of how to make great videos with color. And today it's all about using the Lumetri Color Panel, and most importantly, how you can leverage skills that you probably already have if you've ever done any photo color correction in Lightroom or using Camera Raw with Photoshop. So here we go. Let's bounce over, we'll switch my screen and go into Premiere Pro. Now, as I mentioned moments ago, I want to relate doing some very basic color treatments here around workflows in Lightroom. So before we actually even touch Premiere, one thing that I wanted to point out, because this is something which I still do, is, and particularly when I'm shooting things in 4K, but even still when I'm doing 1080, I shoot all my video with a Nikon D800. So I'm still working personally at 1080p. And often I will do stills from my video. So one thing that I just wanted to point out as, again, a reference to sort of the tools that you might know from Lightroom's Develop module is how to take stills and kind of bring those directly into Lightroom. So inside your program panel here, and we're looking at this shot of a Santa Cruz sunset. Now this is actually something that I just submitted to Adobe Stock, and we graded this the other day as kind of a test stream around color grading. You'll notice that we have this button here, which is called Export Frame. Now, if you don't see that button, oh, and you're not seeing the tooltip. Sorry, let me move that up a little bit. Export Frame. If you're not seeing that little camera icon inside of your program or source monitors, you can add it by going to the button editor. And when you click on the button editor, you can see the camera right there, and you simply drag this down into your selection of buttons here, and it gets added just like that. Now, what I will typically do is I have a folder set up in Lightroom. Now, if you're also using Lightroom CC, the latest update to Lightroom, remember that we have the Lightroom CC mobile component. So this is really awesome to be able to access your imagery on your phone when you go. So a lot of times I'll do quick stills out of the program monitor here. And when I click on that, you can see that I've got this going to my Creative Cloud file storage in a specific folder called Premiere Pro Stills. This folder also has a companion folder in Lightroom, so I can just pull those frames right in. And you can see you've got a bunch of different options for how you want to export. I'll typically do TIFFs or JPEGs. In this case, this was shot on the iPhone. This is also 1080, not 4K, as I found out the other day. But I'll export those files and bring them right into Lightroom CC. And again, import them via my specific Premiere Pro Stills folder, which I've got here. Okay, so here's the still directly from the Premiere Pro timeline. All of these, in fact, were exported directly from the program monitor right here. All right, so here's a couple of these are some iPhone shots. This is Nikon D800, and you can see these look pretty flat. And then we've got a couple of, again, iPhone shots done in Santa Cruz. So again, relating this to Lightroom skills, Lightroom's Develop module. So if you haven't checked out Lightroom CC yet, this is Lightroom CC. Looks a little bit different, but if you want to start editing, simply come up here to the upper right-hand corner where you see it says Edit. Click on this, and now you're going to see, again, a lot of the same familiar panels that you saw in the previous Lightroom desktop version, okay? I want you to pay attention first up here to Light and Color, because what you'll see, where we're talking about some of the main components here, exposure, contrast, highlight, shadow, whites, blacks, and then your temperature, tint, vibrance, and saturation. So when you look at those controls, you think, okay, yeah, sure, I've used those millions of times. Well, once again, bouncing back to Premiere, inside of the Lumetri Color Panel. Now, again, I want to point out that I'm currently working in our color workspace. Now, I've obviously moved my panels around. You may not have your workspace look exactly like this. If you don't see the Lumetri Color Panel, you can always open it up from the window menu right here. And again, just by selecting the color workspace, which can also be accessed by the window menu as well, it will automatically pull up the Lumetri Color Panel for you. Now, at the very top, there's 5 or 6 rather tabs inside of the Lumetri Color Panel. The first one, and the one that we're really going to focus on today, we'll probably look at probably 2 of these, Basic, Correction, Vignette, and maybe we'll get to Curves, is this one here, Basic. And inside of Basic, you're going to see, well, first of all, under White Balance. Now, we're going to come back to Input LUT and HDR Whites. This is for next week's lesson All right, this is something, again, that you don't see in Lightroom natively, so I wanted to make this really very much like what you're experiencing in Lightroom. But we'll come back to this, and I'll talk about this in just a few seconds. But first, you see white balancing, and then you have your white balance selector, your white balance eyedropper, which you know, again, from Camera Raw and Lightroom, temperature, tint, and then under tone, you have exposure, contrast, highlight, shadow, whites, blacks, okay? Saturation, which you have here, and you also have an additional vibrance and saturation in the creative panel of this, all reflect essentially the same settings that you see right here in the first 3 panels of Lightroom, okay? So the idea was that we took these same sorts of controls, and we didn't merely just put them into Premiere, but we kind of reimagined them for video, and specifically where you're really going to see a difference in how they affect the frame is, for one, in exposure, where we're not just doing gain up or down, but we actually use different algorithms from different cameras to simulate proper camera exposure. So this is just going to function a little bit more accurately on your video. Very powerful, very legit, perfect way to do your color grading and color corrections. And again, it's going to feel very familiar because it's just like Lightroom. So if we were in Lightroom and we wanted to, and let's say we're on this clip right here. Let's go back to this shot. Now again, whether you use your histogram or not, you can just see it was sunset, so we're kind of losing a little bit of shadow detail. Got a little bit of color noise in here. So one of the first things I might do is, again, kind of play with the exposure. The exposure actually looks pretty good. Maybe we'll even drop it a little bit. Work with our contrast. Again, so probably drop the contrast just a little bit here. Highlights. Now the highlights look pretty okay. Again, looking at our histogram, nothing's blown out. I'll typically drop those just a little bit for effect. Shadows, again, we might want to bring up a little bit of the shadow detail. White, black. Now again, when we go into color here for temperature, this was sunset, so I don't want to cool it off, right? I mean, I could, that looks cool, but if I really kind of want to reflect how it felt, I probably want to warm this up a little bit, and maybe even adjust the tint a bit more towards our magenta. This is now starting to feel like it did when I was there. A little bit of vibrance, a little bit of saturation. And if we want to add drama, now these are 2 effects that you're not going to see on the Premiere side, but I'll just point them out here. Of course, you've got clarity, mid-tone clarity, and DeHaze. And my colleague, Brian O'Neill Hughes, says if you want to bring the drama back into a shot, use that DeHaze. And look at what that does. I mean, just immediately, you know, just really gives us this super, super colorful, beautiful, dramatic kind of look. So let's go back over to Premiere. Now, as I was mentioning before at the top, and we'll cover this next week in greater detail when we really start to talk about working with flat footage versus footage that has color sort of baked in, and some of the best practices when shooting before grading. But just real quickly, again, at the top of basic corrections here, you see that we have our input LUTs. And there's really 2 different types of LUTs. And for those of you not familiar with what a LUT is, it stands for lookup table. And specifically an input LUT is used really just as a way to sort of reinterpret the footage coming off of the camera, oftentimes applied to flat footage to allow the colors to display properly. And you'll see this all the time when people are shooting, particularly people who are shooting Sony, where you're shooting S-Log. You might even see, I think we've got these in by default. Okay, yeah, okay, we don't have those in by default. Again, next week I'm going to show you where to find all those additional S-Log LUTs, even some additional input LUTs for flattening out footage if you recorded them with a particular picture style and things just kind of look baked in. But again, you will often apply those before you even begin grading, just to kind of get things as where you need them to be as a starting point. We're not going to cover that today. Now here, when we go down to white balance, this was something that we added a couple versions ago, was our white balance eyedropper. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the white balance looks pretty good right here. But again, if I wanted to re-white balance the shot, I can take my eyedropper, and we're looking for sort of a neutral-ish, whitish gray, and you know, I could go to something in the clouds here. This probably isn't going to be perfect. Reselect that, and it just does a slight adjustment here. And you can actually see it's not too far off. In fact, the tint is probably right where we want it to be. I would probably just increase that temp more towards the warm values because, again, this was, in fact, at sunset, okay? Now, as we get down to our additional tone controls, this is where you're really going to start to see the power and flexibility of Lumetri Color kick in because you don't have to have that fear anymore. I can't emphasize enough that prior to this panel, it just, you know, if this was all that I had to work with, and anyone who used the previous 3-way color corrector knows what I'm talking about, I don't know, this doesn't do anything for me at all. I mean, I know what shadows, midtones, and highlights are. I get what I'm looking at. I just didn't have any great skill in how to adjust to those properly and quickly. And it scared me, and I never got very far. So here, coming from Lightroom, this makes total sense to me. Now again, when you start to adjust exposure, and you can even see this as we're adjusting here, this really feels like camera exposure, and you can really see how, you know, just like, and especially in the case of this footage, because this is compressed H.264 coming off the iPhone. So we're revealing a little bit of the cloud detail that was perhaps lost. You're actually seeing quite a bit more when we drop the exposure just a couple of stops here. But again, you know, this is, you want to be subtle with this control because this is really simulating your camera exposure. So if I were shooting something that was actually 422 or 444, greater than 8-bit footage, again, this is 8-bit coming off of my iPhone, we'd see even more cloud detail. We'd see even more detail revealed by adjusting things like our exposure control here. So this is a very powerful single slider that really, really beautifully allows you to readjust that exposure very efficiently. Contrast, again, we all know what this does. Now I'll typically drop the contrast for a shot like this. First and foremost, probably to give it a slightly more, a little more film aesthetic-like look. We'll see some of that when we get to creative in just a second. Again, because it's sunset, I might adjust the highlights here. Now, stylistically, maybe we want to blow them out a little bit more since we're pretty much in range. Also, in the third week is where we're going to talk about using Lumetri scopes, so we'll cover that more then. So we'll drop our highlights just a little bit. If we want to add back in some of those shadows. Fortunately, we weren't completely underexposed, so if I crank this all the way up, you can actually see I've got quite a bit of shadow detail. Now, again, there's some color noise in here, just nature of the beast, but really, it's looking pretty good. I wouldn't go to 100% here by any stretch. It is sunset as well. But we'll just boost those up a little bit. Whites. I always like to say that when you're adjusting these sliders, always a good idea to put them to the extreme and then dial them back to kind of see how they affect the shot. And in fact, pulled way, way down, it has a very nice feel to it. Pulled way, way up, it has a similarly nice feel. So it just kind of depends for what sort of look you're going for. All right. Then we have our blacks. Again, if we increase towards the right here, we can get that sort of lower contrasty like film sort of look, very creamy, smooth. I happen to really like that. Or we can crush it, make it super dramatic. Maybe we'll increase this just a little bit, okay? And then we've got our overall saturation, okay? And without even having a DeHaze control, if we just sort of very quickly A/B against our Lightroom shot, we're getting pretty close, okay? Again, the DeHaze is kind of really making a big difference with the clouds up there, but we're going to accentuate some of that by using the Vignette. And you'll see if we go back to Lightroom real quickly. Again, your same settings, Vignette, feather, midpoint, roundness, you're going to find those same controls right here, okay? So if we want to apply our Vignette, darken the corners a little bit, as Brian would say, add back in a little more drama, something like that. We can adjust the midpoint here. Maybe something like this, roundness, okay, and the feather, just like that. I'm thinking I'm going to go even more on the magenta tint, okay? Full screen here. Oh, and of course, right, yeah, this is video. So this is live. And by the way, if we go into our effects controls, we can turn this on or off, and we can continue to play this back and turn things on or off and make changes to this in real time. And this leverages a feature called Uninterrupted Playback. And if we keep this in loop mode, which you can see I have turned on right here, this is really wonderful because this allows me to make very dramatic changes and the playback never stops, okay? What's also cool is when you're leveraging the different modules inside of Lumetri, you can enable or disable them individually. So we put the vignette on, let's take the vignette off. Okay, there it is without the vignette. You can see that we kind of lose some of that drama. The vignette just kind of it just kind of makes it that much more, it just makes it pop a little bit more, and it just adds a little bit more desire to look at this shot, right? Similarly, with the basic color corrections, we can turn this off. And let's get into creative. Now, we're going to come back to looks in a minute here, but there's this is where you're going to find vibrance. This is where you're going to find an additional saturation control, as well as a faded film control. Now, this one I happen to really like. You can use this on any kind of footage. So just give it, again, a bit of that kind of film-like aesthetic. It's going to smooth things out. It's going to take that edge off. And this also, as you can see, we can preview this in real time. Now, where this starts to lose some of its beauty is because we've got that pretty significant vignette on there. So this is where I might back some of that off if I'm going to use a combination of the vignette and that faded film. But very quickly, again, here's our original. And when you look at the original now, you think, wow, that looks kind of dark. Doesn't feel like sunset at all. Let's go back to our modified one. Now this really feels like sunset, right? We can really feel the time of day when this was shot with some very simple, basic modifications. Now, something else that I want to point out, since we're talking about, well, I mentioned before, sort of 8-bit footage versus 10-bit, 12-bit. And again, this is something which you'll understand if you're coming from stills and photography in Lightroom. So with Lightroom, of course, we're going to tell you that if you're shooting with a DSLR or mirrorless camera, you want to shoot RAW, right? And when you shoot RAW, what is the purpose of this? Well, for one thing, it's going to give you additional, it's going to give you the ability to truly color correct and fix your image because you have all of those pixels, all of that data available to you. Making those changes to color is just modifying metadata. All of it's non-destructive. Same thing here. None of these are destructive applications. Well, and we shoot RAW, convert to DNG, because again, this is putting us in that 12-bit, 14-bit, 16-bit color space. Greater latitude, less degradation. Same thing applies here. Now, one thing to keep in mind, Premiere Pro is always working in a 32-bit floating point color space, which essentially means that even if you have 8-bit footage, like the footage I have here, when you drop it into the timeline, other NLEs back in the day, you used to have to convert to a codec, to a 10-bit or 12-bit codec, something like ProRes, something like Cineform, something like DNX HD, so that you could even begin kind of working in this greater than 8-bit space, all right? The nice thing is with Premiere, and this has always been the case, you don't have to do that. We're always working in this greater than 8-bit container inside of Premiere. So you're always going to get the best quality when using Lumetri on any footage inside the timeline, even if you haven't converted the file format. This is H.264, all right? Now, does it behoove me to convert this footage from 8-bit MP4 to 12-bit GoPro Cineform? Well, yes, no. As I always say, whatever was lost at the sensor is still gone. So converting it to another file format isn't buying you anything. You're not going to have any more latitude for grading. You're not going to have anything. Again, if it was lost when it was captured, it's gone, right? If all of your highlights are blown out and your shadows, the blacks are crushed, so there's just no shadow detail, and you convert to 12-bit, that doesn't suddenly mean that all that detail comes back, all right? So you don't have to convert for those purposes. There's other reasons to transcode and convert. This is something we're used to in Lightroom. Yes, of course, you can use just raw native CR2 files from a Canon or NEF files, and I don't know what the Sony format is. But we recommend going to DNG, your digital negative. That's just kind of your standard container for raw media. And you're doing that again, as opposed to color grading a JPEG, right, which is already compressed. So those same kind of concepts apply. Here, I'm working with iPhone footage, but again, I'm working in this greater than 8-bit color container. So I don't have to do anything. I'm going to reap the benefits inside of Premiere Pro here. But if you shoot RAW, if you shoot in 10-bit or 12-bit, your results are even better, okay? And of course, you don't always have that option. One thing which you can do on a lot of older DSLRs, typically many of them will have an HDMI output, which you can then send to an external recorder, something like a Key Pro or an Atomos machine, and capture live ProRes or DNX or whatever 10-bit. And again, that's just going to give you a little bit more natural latitude for grading. But ultimately, you don't need that to work with that footage inside of Premiere. And that's something really significant, is that you can just throw everything in here, drop it in the timeline, and start working. So that's the basic correction panel. That's our vignette panel here, all right? And for today, I thought we would talk about 2 additional panels. Now, we're going to go into Creative for a second here, and let's go over to this piece of footage. All right. So this footage happens to already be graded. And in fact, let's go ahead and you can see here in our effects controls, I've got the Lumetri Color Panel applied. So if I turn this off, here is the native footage. Now, once again, this was shot at sunset on the beach in Santa Cruz. And same sort of things. Now here, it looks like my highlights are kind of approaching that blown out area. All right. So this is where in basic corrections, you can see I pulled those. We've got it off right now, but I pulled those way down, right? If you want to tackle some of those highlights and try to tame some of those highlights. And this is where the Lumetri scopes really come into play. Again, you'll see this next week. But actually, yeah, if we look here, and again, I'll give you all the details of what all of this means. But real quickly, if you look at the top of our scopes here, and you see that I've got signal that's pegging at 100 right here, you can see this hitting the top. Not good. You don't want to be there. You can be there, but you don't want to be there ultimately. So you can see that we've just got, we've got some blown out highlights there. It's 8-bit footage shot on the iPhone. That's fine, whatever. Okay, so we've also got our contrast dropped here, which will help in that arena as well. You can see that I brought out some shadow detail. And when we turn back on that Lumetri color effect, it really now feels like sunset. But beyond just the basic corrections, I also added a creative look, or in this case, a creative LUT. So remember, as I mentioned, there's sort of the input LUT, and then we have the display LUT, or the look. And this is basically used as a way to change the color style, right? Now, the great thing about these looks is that we have dozens of them as presets available to you. So just like in the new Lightroom CC, where we have our preset section here, and let's go to another piece of footage, something like this elephant. Go into our presets, all right? And as I hover over these different presets, this is going to give me different looks for our footage here. Oh, that one's kind of nice, turquoise and red, all right? Your looks or creative LUTs inside of Premiere Pro will offer the same types of flexibility, all right? So let's go back to Premiere, and you see that I've got this blue steel look applied, not to be confused with Blue Steel, Ben Stiller, all right? So at the top here, we can just start cycling through some of these. You can see we start with something like CineSpace. Now that really feels like sunset. And again, this is where I love to do the before and after. It just changes the entire mood so quickly, right? Here's the original shot. Here's how it felt when I was there. And it actually probably looked pretty close to that. That's a bit dramatic. And again, we're losing a little bit of some of our shadow detail there, although that kind of works for me. All right. So there it is with CineSpace applied. Okay. Let's go and just kind of cycle through a couple more of these. So you'll notice that we have a whole bunch of film stock emulations. So by applying one of these looks, this is actually going to simulate what this would have looked like if it was shot and then printed on film, okay? And what these mean when you see like Fuji Kodak, shot on Fuji, printed on Kodak. That's what that's in reference to. I happen to really love this Kodak 5218, 2395, also 2383. It depends on the footage, of course. But what you'll see as we kind of cycle through these, they're just going to give them entirely different looks. Again, with that kind of softer film-like edge. Let's go ahead and turn off the basic corrections so these kind of reflect the look here a bit more accurately. Also notice that we have this intensity slider here. So when applying these different looks, you may have to back off on the intensity. Now, this is one of the best and probably most important controls that you need to know about when applying a creative look, because many times, in many cases, when you apply, by default, it's at 100%, it's too much, right? So if we go back to something like our CineSpace, you know, at 99%, that's really almost too much. So the intensity slider allows us to back off or increase the amount of how much that LUT is being used for display on our footage, okay? And you can see that, again, notice now the highlights are really, really getting blown out. If I turn back on our basic corrections, it fixes some of that. And this is where I, again, also made those temperature and tint controls. So your basic corrections and your creative looks work in tandem, okay? Incidentally, the default display that you're seeing inside of this preview window is showing you what the look is applied without any other changes. So if you notice, even when I turned this off, these didn't look exact. Yeah, that's because I've got faded film on here. I've got Vibrance. I'm desaturating a little bit. I think there's some curves on this as well. Yeah, so the preview here isn't exactly what I'm seeing. That's because I've modified other settings here already, okay? But intensity, this is something which you will come back to quite often, and again, can really, really change the feeling of your video very quickly. So we'll cycle through some of these. You'll see we've even got some really beautiful monochromatic ones. And these film ones, again, I think they really sell the idea, all right? They really, really sell the idea quite beautifully, all right? So let's skip through some of these. Again, get to some of our, blue cold. That's really nice. And this is another example where if we turn on that basic correction, actually even like that kind of static as it is, look at the before and look at the after. Now, this is something which, to be honest, I could not achieve manually with color wheels. Certainly not in the past, maybe today because I'm a little more familiar, but to achieve that kind of really super dramatic, crushed blue kind of look would have taken me ages. And we still have shadow detail. I can still see I don't know if it's really coming through on the stream there. I can see it just fine on my screen. You'll just have to believe me. No, I think it'll be fine when I translate this for our edited version. But we still have, you can still see the ground down here. So there's still shadow detail in there. There's still some really nice presence. But again, we've also got the intensity up to 108%. So we might want to back this off just a bit, and find that kind of, wherever that sweet spot might be. I think we were at about 60% before, something like that. Looks really good. We can continue to go through some of these. Again, there was blue steel, and you can see that's kind of accentuating a bit more of the magenta. By the way, you'll notice that as I'm previewing them here, it doesn't change. And when I find what I like, when I want to change it, single click inside the panel right there, and it changes the LUT on screen, okay? So we'll keep going through some of these. Gold orange, all right, that one looks pretty good. Now again, here's an example of where a lot of that very low contrast. Maybe we don't need as much faded film now, or maybe I want a little bit more intensity of the LUT to really accentuate that bright yellow sky. So if you've never tried these creative looks, start using them. Start experimenting with them. It's a great way to kind of just get started with adding some cinematic type color. I can't emphasize enough, use that intensity slider, and typically I'll never go to 100% intensity. You'll probably want to back off on that. So be very careful with that. But this is your best friend right here, the intensity slider, because this allows you to really deliver something that's going to look very dramatic. But again, keep it in check. Now, under adjustments, you've also got, as mentioned, faded film, vibrance, and saturation. So these two, just like in Lightroom, okay? Vibrance, much like in Lightroom. Be careful, be gentle, all right? You can also get some very different and interesting looks by sort of dropping the vibrance here. And then similarly with saturation, you just want to be mindful. And this is where in next week when we start talking about the scopes and things, monitoring how much of this you're pushing out is going to be essential. Now, if you've got the benefit of an external monitor via HDMI, always a good idea to see what this is going to look like, not just on your computer screen, but on an additional screen as well. And again, when we start talking about scopes, you'll start to see how these things change and how the looks are affected. All right. And some of these, as I go through them, I mean, they're so cool. When you look at that original, I mean, this is, to me, actually, this one looks very similar. This is kind of how the water, I remember it. It kind of had that same sort of vibe going on. Now, do we have any vignette on this? Yeah, we do. Got a little bit of vignette. All right, a little bit of drama, just darkening the corners a little bit there, okay? And then, of course, you have sharpening. Sharpening, like many things, you got to be careful. You got to be careful with sharpening because it can get out of hand real quickly. And in this shot, let's go to this elephant here. Get a nice, I think I get nice and tight close up right there. All right. Just find a nice sharp frame. Again, a little bit of motion blur, handheld, elephant is moving. All right, but we can really see some nice detail on his whiskers and things. Those whiskers on his mouth and on his eyelashes. Elephants have amazingly long eyelashes. All right, and I'm just scrubbing through to find a couple of nice sharp frames. Let me go ahead and just boost up this sharpening, okay? Now, here it actually looks okay. You'll see as we're playing this back, and here, let me go ahead and I'm going to wind this back so you can kind of see the whole clip. Let's just increase this. I would never do 100%, but I'm just going to go really intense on this. You can see now, like you'd expect, when you start to overdo the sharpening, and by the way, we're in full quality, we're not dropping any frames. I mean, it looks better than I expected. Part of that is because I shot this super flat, but it starts to introduce a bit of that kind of digital feel where suddenly it almost looks composited, right? Especially if you look at these branches. And this was shot with the 70-200 f2.8 on the Nikon D800. So we've got a nice shallow depth of field here. You can see in the foreground it's kind of very defined tree limb. Again, there's the edge of our elephant. But it's almost starting to look a bit composited. So you already know this from stills. Be careful with sharpening, and particularly video sharpening. And the opposite of that, of course, is that we can soften. So you can see here now we're almost, you've got this sort of blurred look. But this can be a very useful tool, particularly if you've got a little bit of noise in sort of shadowed, dark areas, right? So your image was a little bit, your video was a little bit underexposed. A little bit of softening, sort of de-sharpening, can also mask a bit of that too. You don't want to go too far because then it's going to soften everything. As mentioned, this footage was already shot very flat. So by adding some of it back in, it doesn't really over-accentuate. And actually, it seems pretty nice. But you need to be mindful and you need to be a bit careful of how that's used, okay? So, and then you also have shadow tint and highlight tint. So if you wanted to accentuate, again, this was also done around sunset. So I might go back into my basics here. Let's adjust our temperature and you can really see that sort of sun peeking through. By the way, this was shot in South Africa in the winter, so everything was dead. So the landscape was flat and dry and not super colorful. So here's where we can, again, get a bit more creative by adding some of that back in. Now, highlights to me actually look like I can boost those a little bit, take a little bit of advantage of that. Contrast, maybe. Again, depends on if we want sort of a more cinematic kind of look with this or a slightly more film-like look. Perhaps we drop the contrast a bit because if I'm going to add a creative LUT on top of that, if I've already added a lot of contrast, this is a common problem with adding any kind of preset, right? And you see this in Lightroom, you see this with Instagram, you see this with using third-party plugins. If you start boosting a lot of contrast and black on your video here in basic, and then you apply a creative LUT, which by default has the intensity at 100, it's going to be too much, right? So, and just case in point, let's go ahead and increase this. So I happen to like this right now, okay? That looks pretty good. That's good contrast. Let's just go to something like that Cine Space one. I mean, right? It's instantly too much, all right? And this is what it should look like if we didn't have any basic corrections. So Cine Space is pretty heavy to begin with. So again, we would probably back some of this off like that, go back into basics and drop a little bit of that contrast. And now we're seeing a little bit more detail. And if we actually dropped the contrast to begin with, let's go down to around 30, back to creative, increase our intensity. Now it actually seems to apply this a bit more intelligently. This looks more of how I would have expected it to look. All right. And actually, that looks really nice. And that feels, once again, exactly as I remember it. Okay. And as we're playing this, as mentioned, here we can do our before, flat, creamy, lifeless, after. Before, after. All right. So a little bit of sharpening, a little bit of intensity. Pretty cool. No vignetting needed on this. We've already got a lot of drama. And again, so this is where if we were going to go into Lightroom and, same kind of thing here. Let's increase our highlights a little bit, right? This is a still right from the video. Drop our contrast. Drop our exposure just a little. Warm this up. And I could probably, I've never really got, again, I don't know if these values will equate identically, but you could probably get pretty close. Let's increase a little bit of saturation there. Let's do a little bit of DeHaze, which I'll consider the DeHaze in this case almost like our CineSpace LUT. All right. And this can probably be even warmer. We're getting a little bit of green there, so I'm going to increase some of that magenta. A little bit more warmth on that. Okay. Subtle change. Just a little bit. And I probably even need to white balance this a bit more than I did. All right. Maybe adjust the black level too. Okay. This one seems to have a little bit more, we're letting a little more of the green and yellow pop through, but they're fairly close. Okay. We're not A-Bing them side by side. You get the idea. The point is, it's the same sliders. So I know how to do it there. I can now do it here really simply. All right. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about curves as well. So curves, of course, you will all know from Photoshop. You know these from After Effects. Many of you may know them from SpeedGrade. These are our reimagined RGB curves. We've always had curves in Premiere Pro, but now you can find those curves natively inside of the Lumetri Color Panel. And here, let's go to something like this shot, or maybe this shot too. This one isn't bad because this shot is a bit problematic. So this was shot in Egypt at Giza. There's the big pyramid, as you can imagine. So a lot of basic corrections probably needed on this, if nothing else, just to drop some of those highlights. Because again, this was shot on a Canon 7D. So I'd probably have to bring these all the way down. If we just go into some of our Creative LUTs here, let's see what we get. I'm thinking CineSpace might actually do it as well. Now, next week I'm going to talk, when we talk about HSL secondaries, we'll talk about using secondary color for things like sky replacement and doing treatments to skin tones and stuff like that. But here you can already see that suddenly now we've introduced back a lot of color that just wasn't there to begin with. In terms of kind of adding a little bit more drama, you can see some cloud detail barely just peeking through right there. This might be an opportunity for me to use a little bit of a vignette. All right, got to feather that a bit more. Something like this. Adjust our roundness. Okay, just a bit. By the way, this was as a result of using the native 18 to 135 kit lens. I think I shot this with my kit. I'm 99% sure I shot this with my kit lens back in the day. But once again, here's our before. Here's our after. Pretty dramatic. Still have nice shadow detail, right? Go full screen. This might be another area where perhaps we add just a little bit of sharpening. Just a little, so those bricks really kind of pop out nicely. Now, let's just say, these were totally different lighting scenarios, but let's say that I wanted to actually apply this same one to this one here, which is already a bit underexposed and the contrast looks a little bit different. Well, it's very easy to copy and paste settings across a single clip or multiple clips. So I'm going to right click or control click on this first clip here and choose copy. And then I'm going to select these two clips down here in the timeline and choose paste attributes. This is something really useful if you've got a bunch of clips shot at the same time, same lighting, same location. And again, you will likely, in the process of grading, maybe need to adjust color over time. Assuming you have a series of shots that have the same look, shot around the same time, it's not a bad idea, and it's a good practice to, set one and kind of paste across multiple others. Totally legit. Paste attributes will let you to do that. Now, it also allows you to paste any effects and things, including audio effects, to those clips as well. We didn't make any static opacity change, so I'm not worried about that. Notice you can also scale attribute times if you've got particular keyframed stuff in there. But in this case, we're simply applying our Lumetri color effect. So the one that we've applied to that pyramid, we're going to apply to the other ones. Click OK on that. And now when we scrub over to these, now, as I mentioned, using CineSpace, this is almost in total darkness now, right? So yes, we could decrease the intensity here, but on this particular shot, it just needs to be re-exposed for one. And by the way, you're seeing a little bit of banding and noise on here. That's kind of the nature of the beast with this shot because it wasn't really exposed properly to begin with. So this one isn't going to hold up quite as well. Again, we'll back off some of the intensity. Something like that. Okay. And now they're actually a bit more in range. You know, here we could probably add back in a little bit more blue in the shadows, right? We want the shadows to kind of reflect a bit more blue. So here under shadow tint, we can start to drag this, start to add a little bit more blue there, all right? Or again, if we want to kind of find right where that spot is, warmth, right about there, maybe some of our highlights again. Bring these a bit more to blue, kind of getting out of the range here, something like that. All right. And now they're looking a little bit closer, okay? Still using that CineSpace LUT with an intensity of around 60%. And if we wanted to take some of that noise edge off, add a little bit of the faded film. Again, it's probably a little hard to see, but I'm seeing some color noise here. So faded film will take some of that away. And additionally, if we wanted to, we could de-sharpen a bit. Probably not, because we want that clarity of the bricks and of the pyramid to really shine through, okay? And on this shot, this one doesn't look too bad. Again, it's too intense. So I probably back this off, something like that, and maybe go back up to our basic corrections and bring back in some of those highlights. We didn't need to crush those down so much, okay? There's our before. There's our after. That actually looks pretty good, right? There it is, again, shot flat, and we'll talk about this more next week. There it is with a little bit of color. Looks very cinematic. By the way, those little flickers that you were seeing as I was zooming out, yes, non-fixed aperture on the lens there. That's how I know that this one was also shot with that 18 to 135 non-fixed aperture. As you're zooming out, aperture's changing, you're getting those kind of little flickers. So that's what you were seeing there. But in any case, I happen to really like this. And again, the clarity, really beautiful sharpness and clarity here, before, after. And when we talk next week about HSL secondaries, we can really fine-tune specific color ranges in this shot to make it even more beautiful, even more present. And there's very little changes done here, honestly. So we could even come in and just warm this up a bit. And look at the difference. That really looks wonderful. Okay. Before, after. And just because I mentioned flat again, part of the reason for shooting flat in video, and there's many benefits to it, but as you can see, when you shoot flat like this, this just gives us, it allows us to add that color back in. If it came off the camera like this, I mean, if this was what we had and it's right and it's good, that's awesome. But it becomes increasingly hard to take that stuff away without adversely affecting the video, all right? So if you've got all this color baked in, super high contrast, super saturated, super sharp, if you need to pull back any of that, when it's all baked in, it becomes harder. And your video, particularly if it's not raw, if it's 8-bit, may suffer. So when you're using, again, compressed, all of this is compressed footage here. Shooting flat by dropping contrast, dropping saturation, dropping sharpness on capture. By the way, this is typically a process of simply going to a picture style or a profile in your camera, DSLR, mirrorless, and choosing, starting with something like neutral. You've all seen those, right? So there's always vivid, you know, portrait, whatever, a whole bunch of different stylistic looks, and then they usually have a neutral setting. Well, if you go into neutral and then further drop contrast, drop saturation, drop sharpness, that's going to give you this kind of sort of very flat, almost creamy look, because then you can start really getting creative with the color that you lay over top of it. So this is another example. Again, this is a shot with the 24-70 Nikon D800. This is a Moog Rogue 1981 synthesizer. Here again, we could do a white balance adjust. So I could re-white balance this shot. Looks like it was perfect as it is. We can start adjusting contrast and things. Or for this is where I might directly go into something like one of these Creative LUTs. I think I used this on the finished version. This is the Eterna 250D 3510. Add a little bit of faded film to this. Add a little bit of vibrance. Maybe cool it off just a bit in our temp, like that. Okay, and that really feels the way this synthesizer feels. All right. Doing a little rack focusing there as well. Okay. As you can see here, this is actually a perfect example without even going into great detail. Clearly, we don't have any blown out highlights, and we don't have anything that's going into total darkness. And as you look at this shot, oh, what just happened there? You can still see, again, I don't know if it's all going to come through on the stream. I'm zooming in there. It's hard to see if it's coming through on stream. But I can actually see detail and dirt. Well, it's not dirt, it's dust in the crevices of the keyboard. Okay, I can see dirt and dust and a little bit of noise in the cracks here. I can see individual specks and flecks of things in the black of the knobs here. So this was pretty well shot, well exposed from the start, and that's going to give you obviously a better result in the end. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about curves, and we'll end it here, and then we'll come back a little bit later. So again, curves, many of you will already know these, and we're going to cover this in greater detail next week as well. You can also see that as I start to apply this master curve change here, how it's really affecting really the overall contrast of our shot here. But these are our reimagined curves, simple, fast, real-time, 32-bit. And just real quickly, I'm going to turn my camera off for a second so that you can see this here. We have a lot of different effect types in Premiere Pro, and you'll see that inside of your effects panel, we have accelerated effects, which refers to GPU accelerated, 32-bit color, and YUV. So if you select 32-bit color, this is going to show you all of the different effects that we have that actually run in 32-bit color, okay? Gaussian blur, Lumetri color, okay, as mentioned, Luma key, track matte key. Now again, we still have these older effects, the fast color corrector, the old RGB curves, the older three-way color corrector, and again, sort of, all of your dissolves, of course, and we don't have to go through all of them here. But this is something essential, and I point this out because as new users, there's a lot of plugins out there, and particularly a lot of color plugins that will allow you to stylize your content. Now, here's something to keep in mind. As mentioned, these are all of those effects that you can see now all are 32-bit. And as I mentioned before, when we're working inside of Premiere Pro's timeline, we're always working in this 32-bit container, regardless of what the master footage was, okay? If you, however, take a color effect, and I'm thinking like Red Giant's Misfire is a stylistic plugin that I like. It adds all the old school like film grain, film scratch, film blotches, all gate weave, all of those things. That's an 8-bit effect. Now it might be updated in the latest version of Universal. I'm not sure. I've got an older version here, but the one that I have is 8-bit. So what that means is if I take an 8-bit effect, a non-32-bit effect, and I drop it on that clip, now we are effectively working in and processing. It's going to dumb everything down to 8-bit. So what happens when you do that is you're more likely going to see on export some banding, artifacting, sort of like you see kind of pixelized color. So you don't want to do that, preferably, all right? So again, if you're going to be working with Lumetri and working with any of these 32-bit effects that you see here, not an issue. Now, someone was just asking about noise reduction. Now, we don't have a native noise reduction in Premiere Pro. I highly recommend Neat Videos noise reduction, and that's neat, N-E-A-T, video.com. They've been doing it for years. They've got a plugin. It's fairly inexpensive. It's awesome, and it's also 32-bit. Of course, the Red Giant plugins, Colorista, all of those 32-bit color. Most of your effects today are designed for 32-bit color, but not all. So it's a really good idea to understand that if you're creating something, and by the way, this applies to, you could be working with red content and you throw some 8-bit footage, 8-bit effects on there. Now, granted, red being raw, you've got such high resolution and everything else, it's probably not going to be as noticeable. But the point is, you're now dumbing it. You're taking advantage of using something that has greater than 8-bit media, throwing an 8-bit effect on there. You don't want to do that. So just keep that in mind, that you want to keep your effects consistent. Additionally, and we'll talk about this next week too, if you're working in tandem with After Effects and you're doing dynamic links from After Effects onto footage here, After Effects, you can switch between 8, 16, and 32-bit. You want to be sure, and this is whether you're using even just text, lower thirds, or whatever, you want to be in at least 16-bit when you're dynamically linking from Premiere. Unless it doesn't matter, unless you don't care. And with some footage, you're not going to see any noticeable banding. It doesn't really matter. Things will be a little bit faster, 8-bit, obviously, compared to 16-bit. But if color is the game of maintaining that highest quality possible is what you're focusing on, you want to make sure that you're at least in 16-bit mode in After Effects if you're dynamically linking elements here into Premiere Pro. Okay? All right, so we covered today basic corrections. Again, your white balance selector, temperature tint, all of your tone controls, very similar to the ones that you're going to find in Lightroom. We also talked about the creative panel here inside of Lumetri, adding stylistic looks, right? Dozens and dozens of looks inside of the creative panel here, which you use after your basic corrections. In Creative, we've got our intensity slider here, which allows you to, again, dial back more or less of a particular applied LUT. Again, there's our before, there's our after, so dramatic. Under that, you've got your adjustments, faded film, sharpen, vibrance, and saturation, shadow tints, and highlight tints. I'm going to bring these more to that sort of bluish green because that's actually kind of how it looks, okay? Something like that. And again, you've also got a tint balance control here, which is useful as well. This is, again, we're looking at those scopes, which we'll talk about more next week, becomes very helpful, okay? I'd even saturate a little bit more, maybe intensify the LUT a little bit more there too, all right? And then we talked just briefly now about curves, okay? Our standard RGB curves. Oh, and of course, our hue saturation curve. So if there's a particular range, and let's see, let's go to a different shot here. These are all very flat, so these are not really going to, I'm going to be able to see those very well. Okay, maybe something like this, okay? So this is, again, iPhone. This is 4K. If you've got a particular range that you want to accentuate or attenuate, drop, you can simply plot points on your hue saturation curve wheel here, or you can use one of the sort of preset color ranges here. And you'll notice now that I'm really just pulling out the red hues, or the red in this range. And by the way, I can add additional points here to really fine tune what it is that I'm pulling out or intensifying. Okay, and you can see that I'm doing it, I'm overdoing it on purpose so you can see how this works. All right. Similarly, if we wanted to, by the way, just double clicking erases all those points. If we wanted to come into some of those warm tones, kind of accentuate the record, which happens to be orange there. I can do a simple overall lift of everything here, or plot 2 points, center around that orange, and start increasing right there, or decreasing, okay? Real easily. Want to get a bit of that teal and orange thing happening to really make it pop, we can do that too. There's not too much blue in this shot, okay? Real simple, real easy to work with your hue saturation curves. You've got your preset color ranges here, so flexible. And again, something which visually, you get a lot of feedback, both in your scopes and right on screen. And this can also be done while it's playing back in real time. And then lastly, we talked about the native vignette, which again, we didn't have in Premiere for a long time now. So glad to have that back here. Let's see. Yeah, okay, we've got a little bit of that on this. Same as we have in Lightroom. Same controls. By the way, if you want that sort of white, you want to lighten the corners as opposed to darkening the corners, functions just like Lightroom. Okay, so your native vignette, adjust midpoint, roundness, and feather. RGB curves and hue saturation curve. Your creative looks with faded film, vibrance, saturation, and sharpening adjustments, as well as shadow tint and highlight tint, and all of your basic corrections. All right, so once again, thank you so much for joining me. Take care. We'll see you next time.